morning from Miami Beach. This is Dr. John Bennett of Neurosurgicaltv. We have the pleasure of having Michael Segru, a neurosurgeon originally from Oklahoma, now in Sydney, Australia. He's going to give a presentation on connectomes and educate us about that. Welcome, Michael. It's all yours.
Hi, how are you? And translating for me today will be Zheng Yan, and who will give a brief introduction to what we're here to talk about today.
大家好，这里是我们的连接组学相关的这种简介课程。然后 Michael Segru 是我们今天的这个主讲的专家。Michael 他是毕业于哥伦比亚大学，然后他获得过医学博士，然后也在旧金山加州大学完成了他神经外科住院医师的实习。那么他现在是在澳洲工作。他是神经外科手术和连接组脑绘图领域的一个领军人物，然后在各大学术期刊上发表过超过230篇论文。他的神经连接组学的成果是在世界具有权威性的。那么我们今天的课程将是我给大家介绍连接组学脑绘图的理论基础，并且我们将为大家展开怎么样利用无创的靶向经颅磁刺激治疗技术为肿瘤术后康复和多种精神类疾病的实际临床预后工作怎么样去进行这些我们现在就请 Michael 为我们带来今天的演讲。Okay, Michael, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you for coming today to have me speak, and we'll get into it. Today we're going to be talking about connectomics and what its clinical applications are, what is it, and how can we use it in practice.
我们今天将为大家介绍的是跟连接组学相关的一些研究，然后我们也会为大家介绍我们如何去应用它。
So connectomics is big data similar to genomics. Genomics is big data for genes, and connectomics is big data for brain connections.
连接组学是一种大数据，那么它是和基因组学相对应的。基因组学是关于基因的大数据，那么连接组学也是和这个概念所类似的。
And so applied to neurosurgery, what connectomics gives us the ability to do is to look at a very complicated brain disease like this glioma here, and to determine how the brain networks are organized around this so that we can make a good plan to get a good surgical outcome.
连接组学可以帮助我们在神经外科手术当中进行一些指导。那么我们可以在肿瘤周边地区发现一些连接组学提供的一些纤维的信息，然后我们也可以根据这个临床的指导，然后帮助我们去进行一些医学的实验。
So most of connectomics involves fMRI and diffusion tensor imaging. And these are not new technologies. They've been around since the 1990s, and there are over 550,000 papers. Most scanners in the world will do them nowadays.
连接组学涉及到的技术，它需要功能磁共振和弥散张量成像。那么大部分这种影像都是我们现在的扫描仪可以做到的。然后这些技术呢，从1990年代开始，然后现在已经发表超过550万篇论文，55万篇论文。然后这种技术对于这个领域来说，所有的人都是非常熟悉的。Okay.
So why don't we do them? And if everyone knows what they do, why don't we do them? And in routine clinical practice. And there are many reasons, in my opinion, but one of the biggest ones is that the software solutions are very difficult to get this done on a daily basis and requires PhD experts. And as a result, because we don't get them all the time, we have trouble knowing what to do with the information.
既然这个技术是现在已经是非常前沿的技术，那为什么我们不对所有的病人做呢？那么首先是在于我们的软件并不能很好的去解决相关的问题。那么对于大多数医院来说，这也是非常繁琐的工作，也需要专员去 而且是具备博士专业或者是在相关领域研究过多年的这种专业人士去做。那么所以说我们有些对于大部分医院的工作人员来说，在临床上并不实际。
So as a result, we get very pretty images that don't provide us a lot of insight that we can use to take care of patients.
通常情况下，我们从常用的软件所获得到的信息并不实用。它们虽然很漂亮，但是并不能帮助我们去给病人进行临床治疗。
So just to show everyone what is involved in taking a raw image like fMRI and translating it into a useful image, this is what the raw image looks like. This doesn't look very much different than other MRIs. But inside of it is a very complex signal, the bold signal, at every voxel in the scan. And this is a very large data set.
那么我们通常所看到的 fMRI 的影像，那么这个我们现在所展示的这个 fMRI 影像，跟我们实际常见的是非常接近的。那么这些信息呢，其实包含了很大量的数据，每一个体素之内都包含了很大量的数据。那么我们可以通过这每一个体素去观察它的这个血氧浓度变化，就是我们所谓的 bold signal。
So when we try to tackle problems this complex with millions and millions of data points, one of the key steps in doing machine learning or artificial intelligence is dimensionality reduction.
我们如果对于这样的大信息量的数据进行进一步的解析，那么需要我们通过人工智能或者是机器学习去帮助我们做更进一步的数据处理。那么很基本的一个要求就是降维。
And one of the methodologies for dimensionality reduction that's most familiar to neurosurgeons and neuroscientists is parcellation. Everyone knows at least one method of parcellation, which is Brodmann's areas. Brodmann divided up the cortex into 47 areas in 1908, and there are many other updates to this over the years.
我们对于大多数神经外科和神经病学神经科学相关的专业人士来说，降维并不是一个陌生的概念。那么我们所熟知的大多数医生或者是神经外科医师、神经科学家所掌握到的一个关于降维的方法，其实就是我们的功能分区。那么最早的功能分区呢，就叫做 Brodmann 功能分区，它发现于1908年。这个分区呢，给我们左右的各半球进行了一次功能的分割，并且每一个半球大概有52个功能分区。
And so there are many different ways to parcellate the brain. The one you're seeing here is known as the Glasser scheme or the Human Connectome Project scheme. And in 2016, they published a parcellation scheme that divided the brain into 180 unique areas based on fMRI.
我们在 Brodmann 功能分区之后呢，也诞生了很多其他的功能分区方法。那么对于我们现阶段来说，最新的也是最权威的一个功能分区，也就是2016年的 CP 项目。这个是人类连接组计划，他们将大脑的功能分区分成了左右半球各180个功能分区。这也是目前我们现在的一个相当于一个金标准。
In some areas, like the frontal lobe or the cingulate gyrus, they kept Brodmann's areas or subdivided them. In other areas, they didn't use any of them.
对，相比较于Brodmann 的功能分区呢，我们在这些对很多的很多的区域进行了进一步的细化。例如 Broca 区，然后当然有些功能区我们并没有实际使用。OK。
Now, once you've utilized the parcellation to simplify the problem to something manageable, you can then look at the bold signal, and instead of trying to compare every voxel to every other voxel, which is a huge problem, you can limit this down to just comparing every parcellation with every parcellation acquiring a correlation, and determining how much these two areas are firing at the same time.
我们要对信息进行进一步的简化，就可以把对于选取相关的体素进行两的比较。那么我们可以从体素中提取到的血氧浓度变化信息，然后并且把不同的区域之间的体素的这个血氧浓度信息进行对比，然后找到它们的相关性。
And the reason we care about this is that we know that areas that fire on a very similar time course are usually talking to each other, and they're doing something similar. They're often serving a common goal, like language.
我们通常知道的就是有一些区域呢，他们会同步激发。那么这些同步激发的区域呢，他们物理位置上不一定在同一个位置，但是他们之间存在交流。那么他们就是存在，并且他们就是在执行一个共同的工作，共同执行一个相同的功能。
And so areas that fire together are often wired together, and we call those networks.
那么在共同激发的区域，它们通常是连接在一起，我们把它称之为网络。
And as we begin to move into a 21st century view of brain function, we have moved past the idea of having areas of the brain that are the language or motor areas, and towards the concept of networks, which are areas that may be quite a bit away from each other in the brain, but work together to achieve a common goal.
从我们现代的角度去出发，那么我们所有的这些网络，它们可能负责不同的功能，比如说它们有的负责语言功能，有的负责运动功能，那么一同激发的区域，它们相互之间是有交流的，然后它们会在执行相似的功能，然后这些是我们现有的一些发现。
And this is more than just something interesting. So looking at brain networks has vast clinical potential in areas beyond just neurosurgery and neurology, but even into areas like psychiatry. For example, in this paper in 2017 in Nature Medicine, they demonstrated using the approach I just showed, a method where machine learning was able to identify 4 distinct types of depression that have different responses to therapy, meaning that this has a clinical important endpoint.
那么功能网络的发现不仅是对于神经外科或者是精神病学具有重要的作用，那么对于精神类疾病心理学来说，它们都具有非常重大的研究意义。在2017年发表在Nature Medicine 的一篇文章上面，我们发现对于抑郁症来讲，它会有4种完全不同的功能连接模式。这也就说明抑郁症它有4种，可以被分成4种完全不同的疾病。
One of the challenges of using a parcellation scheme is, while it makes sense to divide the brain up, how do you define where these areas are? How do you define Broca's area? Well, in normal brains, you take an atlas, and an atlas is a collection of points that tell you where each parcellation is. And in a normal brain, you're going to warp this to get this shape to be similar to the brain that you're studying.
其中对于功能分区的一个比较难点是，我们要对于我们是要去发现怎么去处理这些数据。那么对于通常情况下，一些开源的影像数据软件，我们会需要用到一个共性头模，然后把我们的功能分区卷曲到一个共性头模上，那么这就有可能发生一些区域上的无法对应。
And so by atlasing brains and bringing connectivity down to a set alphabet that we use to describe areas, it gives us an immense potential to improve what we're doing through iterative changes, because it allows us to identify part of the brain and all be talking with the same part of the cortex.
对于大脑的功能分区的这种图谱绘制，那么它首先可以帮助我们去鉴别出相关的一些区域，也可以帮我们鉴别出相关的一个绘制成一个完整的一个绘制出一个完整的大脑的字母表，然后让我们能够更好的去把我们所需要的区域和它的功能找出来。
And so when the Human Connectome Project published this scheme here, we became very excited about the potential for using this to describe anatomy, because they were aiming at a different goal. But as a neurosurgeon, we like pictures that look like this, where we know where in the cortex these areas are located, what their white matter connections are, and what part of what network they belong to. And this allows us to use this as an alphabet to describe the brain.
这个连接组学的这种功能图谱给我们一个巨大的潜力，让我们可以发现在连接组上的一些问题，那么也能帮助神经外科专家呢去发现相关的一些他们所需要的信息。那么首先就关于皮质上我们所关心的区域，他们到底真正的他们真正的分布在哪些区域？他们分布于哪些重要的网络？
So one of the other things that having a parcellation scheme and using it allows us to do is to take the vast literature of 550,000 papers and counting from the fMRI literature, which spans 30 years, and to link it to this point with a technique called meta-analysis.
那么我们现在所用到的这种功能分区呢，是基于很大量的 fMRI 的文献。那么这些文献大概有30多年的这种研究历史。然后我们现在需要把我们的从任务态的这种 fMRI 文献当中学习我们如何去对这个数据进行大量的这种数据解析。
So what we did was, and over the past several years now, we've taken fMRI points from the literature and summarized them using a technique called ALE. We then determine what parcellations lie in those areas, and then use this to make very detailed maps of human brain networks. In this case, what you're looking at is the language network.
我们从fMRI 文献中的各种分值，然后我们会把它提取出来，然后总结，并且通过一种叫做 ALE 的技术，然后把我们的这个功能分区会完成出来，然后与我们的 HCP 的这种功能分区进行一个匹配。
So this allows us to have a unprecedented amount of detail in what do we believe is the normal anatomy of human brain networks. And it allows us to communicate and improve on our techniques by having a common way of describing brain anatomy.
这个是能够这样做的话，它能够帮助我们去描述我们的功能分区，这样是相当于给我们一个专业的术语，然后让我们能够在业界进行更好的沟通，也是让我们能够更好的去让大家知道我们所引用的区域都有哪些。
One of the challenges, though, as a neurosurgeon that we found when we did such detailed work was that we wanted to learn how to apply this to the patients we saw in our clinics and in the hospital. However, the techniques for putting an atlas on a brain like this insular and temporal glioma, is very challenging because the brain is very distorted.
我们经常碰到各样的挑战，就是在绘制我们的脑绘图之前。那么，比如说我们需要获取病人的影像资料，那么在各种技术当中呢，我们有的时候对于个体的病例，有的时候往往是很难绘制的。比如说我们这个病人他有一个很大的一个胶质瘤， 那么这个区域的胶质瘤的存在，会影响到它的这种功能分布和它的这种皮区重组。那么这对于绘制脑绘图来说都是非常具有挑战性的。OK。
So I became convinced that a better technique was necessary. So we worked on developing a technique called reparcellation. And what this means is we trained a machine learning model of what the connection pattern of every part of every parcellation was on DTI.
所以我个人认为，对于这种非常有挑战性的脑绘图，需要格外更新的技术。那么我们所用到的技术叫做重新分割技术。我们训练我们的机器学习模型，让他们能够对每一个功能分区进行正确的分区，然后这也是基于DTI 影像绘制的。
And so the machine learning knew what a voxel of Broca's area 44, looks like, so that if there was a tumor in the area, it could reclassify the voxels because it would know that they were connected differently than initially thought. And this allows us to have a lot more flexibility on assigning parcellations in very abnormal brains.
我们的机器学习它能够知道就是它的具体的肿瘤的分布和它相关的这种周边的这个区域的功能。那么我们可以对于每一个体素进行重新的分类然后这对于功能分区来说，我们具有相当大的这种灵活性。
So what this means is that we have a unique technology for mapping parcellations in brain tumors where shape is irrelevant. And so it allows us to look at a brain that's this distorted, where we remove the frontal lobe. You can see the insula is shifted in. There's a large glioblastoma. Despite this, the machine learning knows where the basal ganglia is, even though they're in a different location than they normally are.
我们的这个是我们一个非常特有的技术，然后它能够帮助我们绘制出肿瘤大脑包括它肿瘤区域的这种功能分区。那么我们在进行功能重新分割的时候呢，我们不考虑相关的这种形状因素，我们即便是大脑组织发生了变形，或者是它已经发生了重组，机器学习它能够更好的识别出它相关的功能。比如说我们在这种恶性的胶质瘤的这种病人范例上，我们也可以进行相关的这种机器学习，我们也可以很好的很快的找到它的这个基底节的位置。OK。
So we can now make models of tumors where we can see the function located in the tumor or running through the tumor, as we see here with this low-grade glioma in the supplementary motor area. We don't know that these areas are doing what they normally do in this patient, but we do know that this is a believable map.
我们可以通过相关的技术，让我们的模型能够很快的对于我们的功能进行定位。那么包括肿瘤内部的这种功能的定位，我们也可以做到。包括穿过肿瘤和肿瘤内部的这种功能分区也是可以做的。那么我们虽然不一定能够马上知道我们是不是在针对一个正常的大脑去进行分割，但是我们相信我们知道我们所做的这个结果是可以相信的。
And so now we have the ability, once we know parcellations, given that we've mapped them to networks, and we can acquire this even in the most abnormal brains, it gives us a potential to start talking about brain networks instead of brain regions or areas like Broca's area, and having a much more sophisticated understanding of how our patient brain works.
这样我们具备我们可以对我们的功能进行功能分区的，它能够帮助我们在变形的大脑，就是非正常的大脑上进行一些功能分区。 我们相对于之前所提到的这种大脑区域，然后我们可以现在基于网络去称呼这些相关的功能。那么我们可以使用更加高级的这种技术去帮助大家了解、学习我们的这种功能。
So then the next question then is, because networks as an idea are new to neurosurgeons, it's worth spending some time bringing the world of neuroscience and modern neuroscience into neurosurgery in a way that we have a modern view of how the brain works. And the first question is, well, how many networks are there?
功能网络对于神经外科来说是相对于来讲比较陌生的。那么我们可以通过引入一个现代的大脑的这种现代观点，比如说应用在心理学或者是神经科学当中的这种观点，把它们借鉴到我们的神经外科研究当中。
And so the question when you say how many networks are there is a complicated question, because most networks can be broken into other networks, and networks can be defined multiple ways. But the simple way to start off is that there are 7 networks, and you can see them on the left: sensory motor, limbic, visual, CEN, DMN, salience, and dorsal attention network.
我们所提到的功能网络是一个比较复杂的概念。我们的功能网络每一个功能网络，它可能可以分成完全不同的一些子网络。那么这些网络又可以组合起来去构成一个更大的功能。那么我们回到我们这个网络本身其实相关的主要的网络一共有7个。那么首先我们有这种感觉运动网络，然后边缘系统网络，然后相关的这种凸显网络这些都在我们的这个列表上有列出来。
So running everyone through where these networks are located, note first that none of these networks, with the exception of sensory motor and vision, are completely in one part of the brain.
我们帮助大家去更进一步的认识每一个网络所在的具体位置。除了感觉运动网络和视觉网络之外，其他的都不是在一个相对独立的区域，它们可能就是由好几个部分的区域组合而成。
So sensory motor, vision, limbic, these are the ones that are familiar to most neurosurgeons. What's less familiar are salience in pink, dorsal attention network in green, central executive network here, a very complex network in orange, and the default mode network, which is the biggest network.
我们的这些区域相对于神经外科专家来讲呢，感觉运动区域、边缘系统和视觉区域是相对来讲比较熟悉的。那么可能需要更进一步的了解，就比如说是凸显网络是这个粉色的区域，还有这个腹侧注意网络是这个绿色的后边的这个部分，中央执行网络是这个范围比较广的这种橙色的区域组成。那么还有一个是最大的一个功能网络，它就是默认模式网络 DMN。 OK。
While it may look complicated, I'll show you later that this is not random at all. This is a very orderly pattern, and when I show this, it will be very interesting to people.
我们这些功能网络看上去非常分散，然后看上去也非常复杂，但是我会给大家介绍怎么去看它们，然后是能够更加清楚的去判断它们所在的位置。OK。
So let's run through some of the networks, and we're going to try to give everyone as much as I know that I can get across in this short period of time. I have over 5,000 images of different parts of brain networks, but we're going to try to start in ways that I found are very easy to explain to people who are not familiar with this topic.
我们这个网络，我们会从一些通过我所理解的方式向大家去介绍。 那么看我这里有大概5000种不同的影像数据那么对于不太熟悉这个概念的听众，我们将会通过简单易操作的方式告诉大家如何进行识别。
So the control networks are a complicated term, and the best way to think about them is that they sit at the top of the hierarchy of other networks. And so what they generally focus on is determining where the brain is focusing its effort and what are the goals going on at a given time. And they're really organized around the CEN, or the executive network, and the default mode network, or DMN.
我们先来看一下控制网络。控制网络它是一个层级比较高的网络。首先，它是相对于其他的网络来说，它是在一个比较高的一个阶段那么它是去控制我们相关的功能和相关的一些指令。我们控制网络涉及到的一些子网络包括CEN 和DMN 这两种。Okay.
So the best model to start to learn about how we think this works is shown here. So in short, these networks are not supposed to really be firing at the same time. And the DMN is essentially best thought of as your internal mental state when you think to yourself. Your CEN is what happens when you're having goal-directed external goal behavior. And the salience network turns off one and turns on the other, so that they're never on at the same time.
我们这个地方会有一个两个网络的这种相互切换的这种模型。那么默认模式网络它实际上控制的是大部分我们内部的这种心理状态，比如说我们坐在那儿什么都不想的时候，我们是受 DMN 网络控制的。那么我们的 CEN 就是中央执行网络，是我们具有一个外部强烈的动机或者是一些外部的目标的时候，它会被激活的这样的一个网络。那么凸显网络会在这两者之间帮助进行切换。那么一个网络被开启的时候，另一个网络会被关闭。OK。
So to familiarize everyone with the core of the networks, these networks can be very big, but the central core of the default mode network has three parts: posterior cingulate, anterior cingulate, and lateral parietal out here.
我们每一个功能网络具有相关的这种非常重要的这种核心部件构成。那么对于我们的 DMN 网络来讲，就是我们现在所指挥大家看到的这个区域，它是由3个重要的区域组成的。OK。
The salience network is a middle cingulate and anterior insula, and it's linked by the FAT, or frontal ascent tract.
这是凸显网络，这是大家看到的这个是凸显网络的核心部件。这个就是相关的这种缩写，是它的这个相关的这个亚区结构。
And the central executive network has three parts: a frontal polar region. This thing in the back is supramarginal gyrus, PFM, parietal F medial, and a big area called 8C, and they're linked by a SLF.
这个是中央执行网络的一个核心的区域，那么它也是由3个部分组成的，然后前额的这部分和这个枕部的这个部分 PFM， 然后还有一个叫做 8C 的这样的一个区域。
Now, when we start to look at the control networks, what we really must get our mind around is how many functions of higher cognition require part or all of this network. So the default mode network, as I said earlier, is where your internal mental state. It's where things like concepts of mind, your internal thoughts, and many, many other things happen. Further, the DMN is abnormal in most mental illnesses.
当我们看这个控制网络的主要功能的时候，其实我们有的时候也是需要了解，他们是同时工作还是分开的，去独立完成它的工作。那么我们以 DMN 网络来说，它通常情况下，它的功能是我们大脑内部的一些概念，我们的内部的思想。然后也是我们心理的内部的大部分活动，然后通常情况下 DMN 网络的问题会有很多因为它功能非常多，所以说也是经常发生问题的一个网络。
Now, the salience network, because it can take you out of that mental state and make you pay attention to something actively, it's been shown to coordinating emotions, pain stimuli, alertness, many things. And there are numerous diseases that have been linked to problems with the salience network.
凸显网络它是负责在一个DMN 网络和中央执行网络之间进行一个切换。它这样的这种功能呢，也是帮助我们去及时的注意到我们相关的一些紧急的情况，它也是能够做一些预警的功能。然后它也负责一部分的情绪调控，然后它也是在两个不同大的网络之间进行协调。那么因为这些功能受到影响的时候，就是当 salience 当凸显网络出现问题的时候，也会引起很多的不一样的疾病。
The central executive network is involved in working memory and executive function. And the dorsal attention network, which I only briefly mentioned, is involved in sustained directed attention. There's also a smaller ventral attention network, which is mostly on the right side of the brain.
中央执行网络它负责的是工作记忆和执行功能。背侧注意网络它所涉及到的功能是持续的有方向的注意。那么这里还有一个小的 VAN 网络，然后它是和注意力的改变，就是根据不同的这种输入的感官，感知，然后去改变注意力的这样相关的一个小网络。
Now, again, to review this again, sensory motor, visual, limbic. You have your salience network, your dorsal attention network, CEN, and DMN. Now notice that these areas are much larger than the core areas. There are parts of the CEN and parts of the DMN that are not in the core, but they affiliate themselves with those networks.
我们再根据这个图回顾一下这7个主要的功能网络。那么我们这里已经列举出来这7个了。那么注意到，就是我们现在这个图上面看到的每一个功能网络都比较大，但是它实际上它是包含了我们刚才所在提出来的那些解剖上的这种小核心区域。那么它会有一些其他的区域是附属在它的这个网络之下的。
Now, what's the clinically relevant aspect of this that we've learned is that while we did not know what was in the medial frontal lobe, that when it was injured would cause patients to become abulic or akinetic, we now have a much better idea, and we know that this is the interaction between the DMN and the salience network. So as you can see, this here on the left is a medial view of these networks, and this is out on the lateral surface.
我们对于临床上的这种相关性，也就是我们可以知道在比如说 DMN 网络和凸显网络之间的这种关系。在解剖上来看的话，我们左侧的这张图是更靠内侧的这种 DMN 和凸显网络的这种相互关系。那么这个右侧的图是在更靠外侧它们之间的这种区域上的这种对应关系。
And so it now makes sense of why an ACA stroke or other medial frontal injury would cause a patient to have trouble initiating movement. because in order to do something actively, the DMN must be shut off. It's shut off by the salience network, who is part of the SMA, the supplementary motor area, which it needs to activate in order to initiate an action.
那么我们也就从这个地方可以看出，有的时候我们如果有病人他在内部的这种内侧额叶区域受到这种损伤的时候，它有可能是会造成一些运动上的功能损伤的。那么比如说这是为什么呢？就是比如说我们如果有一些问题发生在 DMN 网络上，那么它这 DMN 网络它关闭了，那么有可能它的这个凸显网络相关的一部分也会被关闭。那么大家可以看到这个辅助运动区域 SMA， 它是和凸显网络是密切相关的。所以说，一旦有一些一些网络的问题，可能引发其他网络的问题。Okay.
And so damage to this axis is very bad. And it can really be some of the worst quality of life that you can cause for a patient where they're unable to initiate or really enjoy life. And we view this as an eloquent part of the brain that should not be damaged in surgery if at all possible.
对于我们的病人来说，这种初始轴的这种损伤是我们最不想看到的，因为这会造成最恶劣的这种病情。那么尤其是意志力缺乏运动，就是它会带来各种各样的影响。对于我们的病人来说是很难，生活质量会急剧下降。那么这也是我们在神经外科诊治过程当中需要格外注意的一种损伤。
Now let's talk about language. Now it's important to note that most neurosurgeons are familiar with this model, where Wernicke's area communicates with Broca's area. But it's important to also know that Broca and Wernicke have been dead for 150 years. And we need to probably consider that they didn't have all of the answers of how language was processed in the human brain back then. And it's time for an update.
我们来看一看一些旧的模型。那么首先是这个是我们对于语言区的这种语言功能的一个模型。那么我们熟知的这个布洛卡区和韦尼克区，他们是负责语言的这种区域，然后这也是我们最早对于语言系统功能的这种认识。这两个区域之间存在一些相互的交流，但是布洛卡区和韦尼克区的这种发现已经是19世纪，也就是100多年前发现。我们也需要一些现代的最新的技术，对于这个语言模型进行一些相关的更新。
Now, because of recent evidence from Alzheimer's and other dementia disease states that cause language disturbances that have shown clearly that the Broca-Wernicke model has some significant limitations. It just doesn't explain all the data. People have begun proposing two pathway models of language. The two pathways, the upper pathway, which is the arcuate fasciculus pathway, is generally thought to be part of phonemic aspects of speech. And the lower pathway, the ventral pathway, is thought to carry information about the meaning of words or semantic meaning.
我们现在比较流行的一个模型叫做双通路模型。然后这个是因为我们在这个最近的现代的研究当中，我们发现 Broca 区和韦尼克区模型，它们存在一些严重的缺陷，它并不能解释相关的一些现象。那么两通路模型，它涉及到的是2个不同的通路，一个是和语义相关的，然后这个涉及到的通路的区域的包括上纵束，那么还有一个就是跟语义一个是语义第一个是跟语音相关的，第二个是跟语义相关的。Okay.
Now, different models have been proposed by Hugh Defoe, Marcel Meslem at Northwestern, and Marco Catani in Italy. where they've determined different pathways of how this information is transmitted. And what I'm going to present to evidence is that all of them probably are part of the system.
我们在这个双通路模型当中，我们列出了3个不同的研究范式。那么 default 和它有2个不同的通路。那么穆斯兰它也有2个不同的通路，然后还有一个是意大利的 Cognition。它在我们的研究当中，其实我们也发现语言系统它会覆盖到这3个人的研究。OK。
So the first pathway, as you see here, is the pathway that we were showing earlier, the phonemic pathway. And this is how information from the left temporal lobe goes to the parietal areas, to Broca's area, and other areas involved in moving the mouth to make sounds. And this controls phonemic speech.
我们第一个通路呢是跟语义，第一个通路就是我们的语义通路。那么我们这个语义通路从左侧的颞叶开始，然后它涉及到一部分的顶叶的区域，然后它们这个通路是跟声音的控制相关的。
Now, it's important to know that this area here, 55B, is recently discovered in the Human Connectome project. And this is a small speech area that is in the middle frontal gyrus, the very back of it. This was not known until the HCP. And we, after noticing that this is clearly a language area, found this case where we removed this tumor and had a very interesting language disturbance. We did not know about 55B at the time.
我们在这里可以注意到55区，55区是最近 HCP 所发现的一个跟语言相关的小区域，然后我们把它称之为一个小语言区域。那么它的位置是在内侧额叶的这个沟回，然后我们是在进行对一个病人进行语言肿瘤切除的时候，我们也发现了这个55B 这个区域。在我们的这个病例当中，把这个区域的肿瘤切除之后，这个病人发生了一些语言上的一些混乱的现象。
Many years ago, we removed this small tumor right at where 55B is. We did a very modest resection, but despite this, the patient has normal understanding, can write and type fluently, and has control of their mouth and tongue, but they cannot speak because 55B is a motor cortex for the larynx. And when this gentleman lost that, he's unable to make coherent sounds into speech.
我们在最早对于这个病人进行肿瘤切除治疗的时候呢，我们切除了这个跟55B 非常贴近的这个区域，然后我们的这个病人在手术之后，他发现他还是具备正常的一些语言，基本上正常的语言功能，他可以理解语言，他可以阅读和写作，但是他不能说话。那么这是因为55B 这个区域是和speak 相关的这样一个功能。
And so what this shows is the potential for connectomics to show us neurological problems and give us an explanation that we would have never been able to figure out without knowing this information.
那么连接组学在这个案例当中就为我们提供了很重要的信息，让我们了解到一些问题为什么会发生。
And so when we start to build a more comprehensive modern version of language, it's important to know that this is a multi-component area. So first, we have the arcuate fasciculus, as we showed, with all of these connections to the posterior temporal lobe.
我们在进行我们在相关的研究工作当中，我们试图去建立一个更加复杂的现代语言的系统。那么这个我们相关的这个区域涉及到很多，我们从这个后部的这个这个区域，我等会再翻译。OK，next。
Okay, and so, but one of the problems with that model alone is it doesn't explain why people who've had anterior temporal lobectomy on the left side have complex, subtle language problems, or why people who have temporal atrophy have complex, subtle language disturbances where their speech is fluent, but is devoid of meaning.
我们在研究这个问题的时候，就发现很多病人他，存在一些他可以理解语言，但他并不能，并不能表达出来。
And this diagram here on the left in yellow provides the most plausible explanation for this. So as you can see, this is a resting state fMRI map, and we put a seed at the temporal pole. And in yellow are areas that fire with the temporal pole.
我们在这里勾出来的这种黄色的区域，它们有些是，就是跟这个生物相关的，然后，它们会在激活的时候和这个颞叶区域是比较靠近的。
So as you can see, you have a strip of areas between the temporal pole and what we would call Wernicke's area. And we also notice that Broca's area lights up, as well as these three areas. Now, if you're paying attention, this is posterior cingulate, anterior cingulate, and lateral parietal. This is default mode network.
我们可以看到我们这里有一个条带状的这样的一个区域，然后它会靠近韦尼克区，然后还在同时被激活，包括这个Broca 区，然后还有的就是这个下图当中的3个区域，然后它们是涉及到这个扣带的区域。
And this highlights the most important distinction in modern language mapping, which is there's speech, which is Broca, Wernicke, and the motor areas for the face, as well as 55B. And there's language, which is what words mean, and the concept and interrelationship of words. And they're not synonyms, they're different pathways.
这些区域的这个工作是非常复杂的，有一些是和说话就是说话相关，然后他们是和55B 这个区域是非常相关的。
So this explains how this model here, which is the Catani model, the Meslem model, where you have ILF connecting the temporal pole to the visual areas, and the arcuofasciculus connecting the temporal pole to Broca's area, as well as the ILF pathway here, can all be put together into a common framework, and this can make sense.
我们从左侧的是这个 Cintani 的这个模型，然后这个右侧的这个是第二个Muslim 的它的模型，然后这个地方我们可以看到它涉及到 ILF 到这种视觉区域，那么这个也是结合到后面的这张图，然后它也是让我们知道这个语言系统的这个分布是说得通的。
And another interesting question, though, is how does this area here talk to the temporal pole? It's not the ILF. The ILF doesn't connect any of these. So we asked that question, and we found a very interesting answer, which confirmed what Catani had thought, which is that this strip of functional connectivity is caused by a series of U fibers that run parallel to the sulcus. And this allows synchronization of this little strip.
我们就是在我们的 Catani 它的这个模型当中呢，这个区域是如何和颞极去沟通的。那么我们也在我们的连接组的这种研究上发现，有一些 相关的这种功能连接性上的一些相关性。
So as you can see, we have the phonemic pathway, the accessory language pathway or the Catani pathway, the mesolam model, as well the auditory system has its own connections to Broca's area. And this shows how highly complex this network really is compared to what we were led to believe.
那么我们结合我们过去的发现和 Catani 还有这个 Mustam 他们的这种模型，我们可以知道，就是我们现在所知道的这个语言系统，那么包括它甚至还一部分的听觉的功能网络。那么听觉功能网络也是会涉及在语言通路系统当中的。这是我们现在对于现有的这个过去。因为听觉系统它和 Broca 区也是有一定的关联，那么这对于过去的这种旧有的这种模型是一个极大的补充。
And so, as you can see, a modern language model is far more complex than what we were looking at earlier. And it's even possible that it's more complex than this. But this is, I think, a simple and understandable modern framework to begin to develop a better understanding of how language is processed in the human brain.
我们所知道的现代的这种系统模型，它可能比我们在这张图里面看到的更为复杂。这个地方我们涉及到的这个系统功能分区会非常的复杂。
And finally, just to briefly touch on the concept of neglect. And neglect is a clinical syndrome that has been fascinating people for over 125 years. Here, we're showing a meta-analysis showing sites in the brain that are common across people who have neglect reported in the literature. And you can see this is in orange.
我们现在来看一下和忽略网络相关的这种这种研究发现。那么忽略网络是一种神经心理上的一种疾病，然后这个问题困扰了研究人员大概150年左右。我们知道就是造成我们在一些文献当中，我们对比了正常人和患有忽略症的这种被试的数据，我们可以看到他们的激活模式是完全不同的。
And so when we looked at who these areas were, we got a map that looked like this. It's very confusing, so I'm going to walk you through it because it was confusing to me when I first saw it. So as you can see, you have A4, which is auditory cortex. You have the olfactory cortex. You have parts of the salience network, DMN, and dorsal attention network. You have the motor strip and sensory strip. And you have the frontal eye field. And this was very confusing to us until we thought about this and noticed that this was linking different networks together. So it was bringing together sensation, sound, visual processing, and binding them into one world. And that neglect was damage to those fibers and disconnection of that system that unified the world into one view.
我们现在就是来看这个忽略网络相关的这种系统。那么忽略症它对于我一开始来说是非常复杂的，因为它涉及到的网络亚区非常多。那么包括了中央执行默认模式网络，然后躯体感觉系统和额叶眼动区，然后包括我的一些 A4，比如说我们的听觉和我们的嗅觉相关的，还有凸显网络，然后这些网络都被它联系到一起。那么我们知道它是忽略症，它涉及到的是一些感知上的问题，包括一些听觉上的问题，以及一些嗅觉上的问题。然后我们可以一个进一步的去对它进行进一步的详细的这种介绍。
And so we thought that this might be the dorsal attention network, which has a very similar pattern, or the ventral tension network, which is only on the right side, similar to neglect. But what we found is that actually it's neither one of them. Those areas are not in the same parts of the brain, and thus neglect is a different problem.
我们一开始注意到的是这个背侧注意系统，那么我们知道背侧注意系统它的这个分布是怎样的，那么还有的是就是 VAN 网络，VAN 网络是这个背侧注意系统，注意网络，然后我们在这个它是主要分布在右侧的这个大脑部分，然后但是实际上这些区域并不完全靠近，也不是完全在一起，也不是在一起的，那么这个问题就变得非常复杂。
So cognition is the mixing of different networks to create a more complicated function. So for example, when we've looked at mathematics, it has parts of the visual system, the semantic system, the language system, motor, the dorsal attention network, and other areas. And the combination of these are how mathematics occurs, the mixture of networks.
我们知道认知功能是可以把它说成一种混合在一起的网络功能，它是一个更高的一个范畴那么它涉及到很多不同的功能网络的结合和沟通。那么我们以数学运算为例，在数学运算当中，我们所使用到的功能包括视觉和我们的语义的这种理解，然后也包括我们的这种运动和我们的这种和我们的外侧的注意系统、注意网络以及这些都是这些网络都是一起共同连接，然后共同沟通，然后才能构成我们的这种数学能力。
So returning to the networks, now that we've covered a few things, and again, this is a very small amount of what is known about brain networks. But let's review this again, and then I'm going to show you how fascinating this really is. So again, sensory motor, vision, limbic, salience, DAN, CEN, and dorsal DMN.
那么我们重新再回顾一下这7个主要的网络，它包括感觉运动网络、中央执行网络、边缘系统、视觉系统、凸显系统，然后默认模式网络以及背侧注意网络。
Now it looks that these are random, but in fact they're anything but. So for example, as you can see in the medial hemisphere, there is this pattern of how these areas intertwine with each other.
我们如果这些网络的分布看上去是非常随机的，但是实际上它们有一定的内部一定的规律。那么我们以这个中部的这种中间的这个区域去看的话，我们可以看到相关的这种网络，它们有一个向右下方的这样的一个分布方向的规律。
Now, here's the more interesting part. So I wanted to show you a pattern that was picked up by some people at Harvard, and I think that it's very, very interesting. So as you can see, DMN, posterior cingulate, anterior cingulate, but then it kind of comes onto the surface here, goes to the language area, posterior to the parietal lobe, and into the temporal lobe. So again, it makes this sort of S shape.
我们在这个我们有一些相关的这种哈佛的研究人员，他们进行了相关的分析，然后他们发现比如说我们的这个功能网络，它的分布有的时候涉及到这个前侧的和后侧的这种扣带回，然后他们会有一个 S 结构。OK。
Now, if you look at the CN, a very similar pattern occurs.
如果我们去看 CEN 中央执行网络，它也会有一个非常相近的这样的一个模式，也就是一个这样的 S 型。
And then with the salience network, the same exact pattern happens, very similar, and they're intertwined with each other.
我们看到的这个凸显网络也具有这样的模式，非常有趣的这样的一个模式来执行。OK。
Now, the dorsal attention network is a smaller network. It's older, but it has a similar orientation.
DNA 网络它是一个非常小的网络，但是它也有这样的一个分布的规律。
So what this argues is that these are not random, and in fact, these are repetitive subunits that are intertwined with each other into this sort of S shape, probably representing some form of developmental organization.
那我们知道，从这些发现，我们可以看出来，我们的功能网络的分布实际上可能并不是随机的，它具有一定的这种方向特点。那么它可能和我们的这个发展就是我们的神经系统的发展，和它的这种构建，在发展过程当中，它具有这样的一个特性。OK。
Now, what's also interesting is that you can look at the cerebellum, and while some of it is motor, most of the cerebellum is actually firing with the control networks.
我们如果去看小脑的话，它有的时候会和我们的控制网络联系起来。
Where this becomes particularly fascinating is when you look at it in the sagittal plane, where you have a repeating of motor, salience, CEN, DMN, and then the mirror image, DMN, CEN, the dorsal attention network, salience, and motor.
那么我们去看它的这个重复性的这种子单元，它会形成一定的镜像。包括我们的这个各种不同的网络都能够映射出来。
This argues that this is an organizing principle of the brain around these control networks, because you see it also a segregation of these in the basal ganglia.
那这个有可能就是大脑构成它的这个构成的这种原则了。比如说我们的这个基底节的这个构成方式。
Also, it's important to note that these networks can be broken into bits. So, for example, while the DMN is a large network, there are different parts of it. There are parts that are language. There are parts that are memory. There's the core network, as well as there is a hearing portion of the network in the superior temporal gyrus.
那么我们我们知道，其实我们的一个功能网络，它也可能划分在不同的功能当中。那么它可能涉及到的是比如说我们的它的这个模块可能一部分分布在它的这个听觉，或者说不是听觉，说错了，不好意思，涉及到一些相关的其他功能。
So when you, again, look at the two streams and you look at the successory language that we pointed out, notice that it exists in the DMN.
如果我们看两条这个路径的话，我们可以看到它有可能都存在于它默认模式网络当中。
So while speech is not part of the default mode network, language is clearly part of the default mode network.
那么，sorry，
sorry.
言语它可能不存在于默认模式网络当中，但是我们的语言系统是存在于我们的默认模式网络当中的。
It's also important to note that while the brain is mostly symmetric, you can see here, this is the same exact map, but in the HCP scheme, that it looks very similar between the two sides. There are some very subtle differences.
我们知道就是大脑，它是具备一定的不对称性的。那么在我们的 HCP 的这个模式下，实际上我们同一个区域它可能是有完全不同的这种 功能分区的，它是不对称的。
For example, the area 44, Broca's area, on the left side is part of the default mode network, and on the right side is part of the central executive network.
那么我们可以看到，在一侧的这个44区，它有可能是在属于 DMN 网络，但是在另一侧它是属于中央执行网络。
55B that we talked about earlier is also asymmetric.
那么55B 区它也是不对称的，它们一边在 DMN， 一边在图形网络。
As well as a few other areas that are important to psychiatry.
那么还有一些其他的区域，它对于这个心理研究人员来说是非常重要的，也是非常重要，但是也是不对称，并不完全对称。
Now, what's really fascinating is when we look at the motor planning areas. For example, the supplementary motor area has 4 parts, but they're not all motor. So for example, that orange area is a part of the salience network. That green area is part of the default mode network. And then of course there's part of the sensory motor network, showing that what a motor planning area is when the control networks all join up and link around a motor area. Motor planning is the control network.
那么我们可以知道，就是我们以运动计划区域去看的话，比如说我们去看 SMA 这样的一个交汇点，那么它涉及到的网络包括这种橙色的凸显网络、绿色的默认模式网络和这个蓝色的感觉运动网络。那么实际上这也是在说明运动计划它实际上是一个控制它需要多种网络去进行相互的这种沟通，然后去进行一个总体的这样的一个调动。
And when you look at other motor planning areas, we see the same thing, which is a mixture of control networks right next to the motor system.
那么如果我们看其他的这种运动计划区域的运动区域的时候，我们也可以发现它具有相同的特点。那么它是一个多个子网络的汇集，然后包括不同的感觉运动区域和中央执行网络以及这个背侧注意网络。那么它们都是在这个交汇点，它去汇集到一起，然后它们也是服务于这个控制网络。OK。
And again, when we look at Broca's area, the canonical Broca's area is where the salience, DAN, DMN, and CN are surrounding the motor area to the face.
我们看这个 Broca 区域其实也是这样，那么它涉及到4个不同的网络，然后它们也是交汇在一起，去共同执行一个相同的功能。
So we're going to now move from the high-level basic science discussion that we've had so far and start talking about how to utilize this in the real world.
我们接下来会把它进行一个更进行一个更应用化的一个介绍。我们是要把它向大家介绍我们如何把它应用到这个真实的这种手术计划当中。
So I wrote a book about this before we had the current software that we have. And what we were talking about in this book was how to utilize thinking about brain networks to make safe cuts in the brain. So for those who are interested, this book is available online. And I encourage anyone who's interested to read this. I spent several years writing it.
我在进行这个连接组学相关的研究的时候，我发表了一本叫做交织流指南的这样的一本书。那么我建议对于这个需要进一步了解的研究人员可以去看一下这本书。
So when we talk about doing brain surgery, no matter how you do it, whether you're aware of it or not, you are cutting next to brain networks, or you might be cutting through them if you're not aware of them. Just because we don't see the anatomy doesn't mean it's not there. And furthermore, we need to move past the idea that there is eloquent brain, the brain, and thus meaning that there are areas of the brain that are non-eloquent or not important. Everything was put there for a reason. The question is, can the patient tolerate losing it? And what are the consequences? And we need to start thinking about this the way the brain really is.
我们在进行手术病人进行诊治的过程当中，我们需要了解到，我们在进行外科手术的时候，实际上我们切除的不仅仅是一个脑部的组织，那么我们切到的实际上是包括很多的功能网络。那么我们在治疗的过程当中，我们需要考虑患者他是否能够接受到这样的治疗，他是否能够承受这样的切除，那么对他的功能会造成怎么样的影响？这都是我们需要更多的信息去更进一步的去解释的。
So in the book, I spent some time thinking about how do we make cuts in the brain that preserve at least the networks that we know about. We don't know all the brain networks, but these at least preserve the major white matter bundles that are linking up brain networks.
我在写这本书的时候，我就介绍了相关的这种，我们可以知道的这种相关的这种功能网络。那么我们在切除的时候，我们怎样最大程度的去保留病人他所需要的具备的基本的功能？那么我们在这个后面会进行详细的介绍。
So to run through a few of these, because I can't cover a 500-page book in 1 hour, I'll cover a few disconnections. This one is called the medial frontal disconnection.
我不能对于所有的这种手术切除进行全部的介绍，我们只是选几个作为范例。那么我们首先介绍的是这个内侧额叶的这种手术。
And so the medial frontal disconnection parallels the motor system, preserves the connections of IFOF, and maintains itself medial to the default mode network, or sorry, lateral to the default mode network.
我们这个内侧额叶的这个手术，它是和我们的运动区相平行的。那么我们是要保留的是它的这个 IFOF 这样的一个网络，然后也会切除掉其他的，也会影响到其他的这个一些功能。
So here you can see an example. This is a big left frontal grade 3 oligodendroglioma in the medial frontal lobe. Jan?
Jan, are you there? She may have briefly fallen off. Okay, just wait there, Mike. She'll be back.
Okay, sure.
We can edit this out if you want.
Sure.
Oh, there she is.
So the answer, if someone has wants, Ahmed asks for more reading, and we have a very large amount of stuff we can direct you to, and we're also building educational videos to help people tackle this, because we know it's completely new and complex. Jan?
Are you there, Jan? She's there.
Internet connection's unstable. Go ahead.
Say what?
She's there.
Oh, sorry. Her internet connection is unstable. Please just go ahead.
Okay.
Usually if you wait, it comes around. Do you want to type some references in the chat there, Mike? If you want, you can just type in the.
Yeah, some of it's covered in the book. We also wrote a 18-part supplement in neurosurgery, operative neurosurgery, in 2018, and I'll give everyone the link to it.
The Jan is back, I think. Can you hear me, Jan?
Yeah.
Okay, she's there. You there, Jan?
Okay. Jan, can you hear me?
She's in the panel, but apparently not connecting.
Okay.
Just
Okay,
wait.
yeah, she said her connection is unstable. She's speaking, but it's not going through. So you can just, yeah, please go ahead and you can continue.
Okay. So as you can see, the medial frontal disconnection involves the following cuts: a cut with the motor system, cut with the default mode network, and a cut with the central executive network laterally. Now I'll show you how you can do this on our software, but you can see that the result is that everything in front of that cut is disconnected from the rest of the brain unless it goes out. Now notice that we didn't remove things in the basal ganglia, basal forebrain. We utilized adjuvant therapy for this. And I'll zoom through this because in the interest of time. So another disconnection involves the posterior temporal lobe disconnection. So what you can see is that in the temporal lobe, there are three systems of white matter. There's the medial system, which is the fornix and hippocampus, the ILF, and the lateral system. So what the disconnection looks like is a cut that attempts to stay out of the arcuate and SLF, to stay in front of those connections, and with the goal of once you enter the ventricle, you're now clear of the system, and you can actually remove the hippocampus as far back as you wish. So for example, in this case, this is an insula and temporal tumor. So the temporal lobectomy is the first step of getting access to the insula. So what you can see is there are two systems. This is a right-sided tumor. Here is the neglect system. And here is the corticospinal tract motor system. So in the insula, this is our disconnection. We want to preserve both the face and arm motor cortices and connections to the spinal cord. And then a posterior temporal disconnection with the removal of the superior operculum, which is also tumor involved, as tolerated by the neglect system. So this is a complex set of disconnections, but the bottom line is it's sufficiently aggressive to handle the problem, but preserves as much of the normal anatomy as possible. Sometimes you're going to, in order to deal with cancer, you're going to have to remove parts of the brain that may have certain functions. But what we're talking about is you don't want to cause problems that you didn't expect to cause. Finally, this is the medial parietal disconnection. In many ways, it's very similar to the medial frontal. You're trying to stay behind the language system and medial or lateral to the DMN, which is modulated by the cingulum. So for example, this posterior butterfly glioma with a large cystic mass, you can see that with the AI-based tools, this is the motor system. The tumor is pretty well tucked into this. So we want to preserve that as much as we can. The language system is lateral. We want to stay medial to that. And we want to preserve as much of the DMN as possible. Now, what you can see is that the AI is able to actually determine where the DMN is. And now what we see is posterior butterfly gliomas, why these patients have significant cognitive problems. And it's not because of the corpus callosum. It's because of the default mode network, which the tumor is wrapped around. So while you might not be able to restore this function, you should try not to make it any worse. So again, the series of disconnections are very complex, but in short, we now have a mental framework of what we're there to do, which in the past, we would have sucked the center of the tumor out and potentially removed parts of these areas because we didn't know they were there. I'm going to briefly talk about this, and then what I'm going to do is show everyone the software and how we actually do this. But interventional neurorehabilitation is a new concept that we brought into neurosurgery, and it utilizes non-invasive brain stimulation. This is FDA approved and approved in most jurisdictions in the world, including it's widespread throughout Europe and China, etc. And it basically utilizes a series of magnets to deliver electrical pulses to the brain at a very high rate through the head. And it is a very, very established technique. There's over 116 randomized controlled trials that I was able to identify. There's probably a lot more since then. And what we know about them is this can be effective for a variety of different diseases, but more importantly, and what we can say convincingly, is that it is safe. And essentially how it works is there are two circular coils of wire. They send electrical pulses in a circle, and then it sends a magnetic pulse into the brain. We know that the risk is very low. The risk of seizures is about 8 in 100,000. This is how we felt comfortable doing this in neurosurgery patients.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
She's back.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Jan, you want to take over?
You can just.
Sure.
Yeah,
So non-invasive brain stimulation is such as TMS can have slight discomfort. It can sometimes cause fatigue, but there's never been a study that shows that the control group did better. So we don't think this has a very high chance of making anybody worse unless we feel like it's safe to try it.
我们现在介绍的是这个介入式神经治疗，然后这个是我们的一个和 TMS 相关的这样的一个治疗方式。在我们的这个经颅磁刺激的治疗当中，我们引入了这个连接组学的相关的技术。那么我们也在大量的临床实验当中，我们针对不同的病症进行了这种相关的这种TMS 治疗。那么我们在治疗过程当中，我们发现病人我们这些相关的技术也是得到了 FDA 的这样的认可。那么我们在治疗的过程当中，病人除了有一些轻微的不适，或者是说它会产生一些稍微有一些这种疲劳感，那么其实我们并没有给它带来很大的风险。那么我们认为这个也是相对于对照组来说也是有很大的这种预后效果。那么我们认为这也是一个非常可以大量开展的这样的一种临床治疗方法。OK。
Now, it's important, and it's obvious to neurosurgeons, but it took psychiatrists quite a while to become convinced that it was important to know what part of the brain you're hitting, and thus utilizing things like image guidance linked to the coils. And the reason for this is that even in this area here, which in real space is 1 centimeter, if you're off by 1 centimeter from this being the ideal target and this being a neighboring target, you're actually hitting completely different brain networks with completely different brain connections.
那么对于我们的这种精神治疗的这种技师来讲，他们也越来越意识到，在治疗的过程当中，他们更多的是需要去知道他们到底治疗的区域存在的位置，大概它的具体位置和它的具体功能是什么。 那么我们知道，在 TMS 的治疗当中，我们会引入一些影像导航工具，但是这些工具并不能很准确的告诉我们是否刺激到了一个正确的位点。那么比如说我们在图示当中的这2个箭头，大家可以看到，它实际上只有1厘米的差别，但是实际上它激活的是2个完全不同的网络。
And so this is what it looks like. So we've selected a target based on the AI software. And this is the coil. This is the patient. You can see that she's here to have her motor weakness treated. And there's an image guidance here. This is one of our fellows doing it. And if you can hear the clicks, every time it clicks, it's sending about 150 pulses into the brain.
我们在这个视频里看到的就是一个诊所里正在进行治疗的这样的一个视频，动态视频。那么我们在这个地方，我们在屏幕这个图片的这个屏幕当中呢，实际上是我们在 TMS 治疗当中使用到的影像导航软件。那么它也是基于 AI 的这样的一个影像导航。那么我们的这个技师他手上拿的是这个线圈，然后他在治疗的过程当中会发出克里这样的一些细小的声音。那么每一次这个声音发出的声音就代表它发出了一个100赫兹左右的这样的一个具体的参数，这个我们等会儿再去看。OK。
So we do it about 5 times a day for 5 days. The treatment takes 5 minutes. We often do multiple targets. And TMS is thought to work by putting the brain into an excited state by which it is very open to plasticity. So we think it's very important to do therapy, either speech, physiotherapy, or cognitive or emotional therapy, whatever you're trying to make better, in the 1 hour between treatments.
我们在进行治疗的过程当中我们使用到的是针对不同的病人会有不同的这种治疗方案。那么我们的这个 TMS 治疗呢，我们每天是治疗5次然后我们一共治疗5天。然后这个在治疗的间隔当中，我们会给每一个病人使用不同的治疗物理，比如说我们使用物理治疗，或者说言语，或者是认知功能上的这种认知行为疗法这样子的一些不一样的这种间断性的这种治疗。
And so, in short, we've begun doing this in neurosurgery patients. Our numbers are much bigger than 42. I need to update this slide. But in general, we've not had any seizures. We've not made anybody worse. And in many cases, we've had amazingly good results. So we've been very impressed with how well this technology does in these patients and how safe it is.
那么我们在我们的这个神经外科临床实验上面，我们也发现我们的这种治疗能够很好的去提高我们病人的这种他的这个治疗反应是非常好的。那么有大部分的病人他都获得了相关的功能上的改善，而且并不会对他造成比如说癫痫这样的后续的问题，也没有相关的这种损害。那么我们现在对我们的这种分析结果是非常满意的。然后我们也是在我们统计的这种病例当中，我们也获得了相当多的这种成功案例。
So, one of the things you want to focus on as you begin to study patients is the machine learning can tell you areas of the brain that are missing. And that's really important because you need to be able to think through areas are not available as targets. And why do we think the patient has the neurologic problems that we're treating them for? And in the past, we never would be able to answer this question, but the software is actually very good at doing this now. And I'll show you this here in a second.
我们的这个软件，它们有一个非常大的好处是，它能够帮助我们去找到病人缺失的这种功能分区。这个也是我们过去的技术是无法做到的。然后，当我们知道它缺失的这种功能的时候，我们也能够更好的去了解怎么去进行我们的目标定位。
So we're going to talk about montage selection, and I'm going to show you how the software is able to do this. But part of it is to think like a doctor and think what network problem or what area or what tract or what anatomy is abnormal in the patient that I'm treating that I want to look at with the machine learning. In short, the machine learning software still struggles with the same problem that any large-scale data, which is multiple comparisons. Our software collects over 25 million data points, and if you look at all of them, you're going to see a lot of noise just because of statistical probability. So it's very important to look at really where you think the problem is, because it's much more likely to give you correct results if you're looking where the problem is.
那么我们接下来会看一下这个蒙版的选择。这个也是让我们通过以这个神经外科手术医生的这种角度去了解我们应该去怎么去选择我们的系统，这种蒙版那么我们在通过
Uh-oh.
Okay. Well,
We may have lost her again.
if the Chinese internet.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So what we're looking at here is how all the parcellations talk to all the other parcellations. And what you're seeing here is a matrix. So the matrix has all the parcellations and then the same exact parcellations here. So every box is a comparison between every two areas. And the red means that these two areas are talking to each other. And the blue means that they're opposite each other. I mean, if one is up, the other one is down. Now notice that a column is one parcellation. So when you're selecting a target, you're selecting one column. And that is a place in the brain. There are two different ways you can display the data. This is the easiest to understand. So as you can see, here we have a comparison of the default mode network and the CEN, Central Executive Network. The blue parcellations are DMN, the orange ones are CEN. So as you can see, the DMN compared with itself is mostly red because it's a network. It's supposed to fire with itself. The CN is the same way. It fires with itself. Now, if you look at the opposite diagonal, it's blue. It's blue because the CN and DMN aren't supposed to talk to each other. This corner here is CN versus DMN, so they're opposite. Now, one of the challenges, though, is that it's impossible for someone to know all of these boxes. So we made a tool over here that tells you what is abnormal. And how it looks is this. White areas are two parcellations that are talking normally compared to a training set of normal individuals. Blue are areas that are too little connected. Red are areas that talk too much to each other, and black areas are just noisy, so we edit them out to try to reduce false positives. So I'm going to show you one case. So looking at the motor system, this is what our tractography looks like. The reason it's much more sophisticated than DTI is that it's not DTI. It's constrained circle deconvolution, or CSD. So you can see all the fibers going to the basal ganglia and the fibers connecting the motor systems to each other.
I'm back. Hello. Hello.
Oh, can you hear me?
Sorry. Yeah, I can hear you. I'm back.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. You can keep on.
Now, as you can see here, this person is missing part of their connectome. The machine learning is able to tell you that what's there, but also what's not there. And you can also notice that this patient still has connections from the SMA to other parts of the dorsal premotor area. But it's important to look at the connections before you pick a target to treat this patient with TMS. So here's a good example, and this is really a great example of why connectivity can be really game-changing for patients. So this is a patient who had a tumor removed in the perimotor area and woke up plegic. Now the connections are still intact. All the motor cortices are intact. They've just been undercut. And when we looked at the anomaly detector, and this is an older version of it, we noticed that there were areas in the opposite side that were overactive. That's very common with unilateral motor injury. So we picked two targets. One is in the SMA. We used a protocol that turns that up. And the other one is on the opposite side, and we use a protocol to turn that down.
所以我们在这个进行相关的这种研究的过程当中，我们其实can you go back to the slide before？我们在进行相关的这种手术治疗和相关的这种 TMS 的研究当中，我们发现我们的连接组学，它可以看到的这个肿瘤切除之后的这种空腔呢，它也是它的这个区域，它的这种连接组和功能分区的这个重新分布。那么它有一些区域它是缺失了一部分的功能，因为它的这个术后切除。那么还有的我们借助我们一个比较老的这样的一个过去的这种异常检测的这样的一个图形，也就是我们这个图谱当中有红点和蓝色点的这种这个图符，我们可以看出来它哪一些功能之间的交流是存在减弱，哪一些功能之间的交流会过度增强。那么我们在这两个fMRI 的影像当中呢，我们可以看到就是针对不同的左侧和右侧不同的半球，我们使用了不同的刺激方法。Okay.
So what you can see here is this is 7 days after surgery. She's telling him to imagine moving his leg because he's paralyzed except at the hip. And that's 3 days later. As you can see, he's still a little unsteady, but he's able to walk on this leg. And he's regained some movement. He ended up making a complete recovery of this. Now, it's possible he would have made a recovery with no TMS, but going from this to this in 3 days is very fast in our opinion. Now, sorry, go ahead, Jan. Jan, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Yep. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, as opposed to continue to talk here, is I'm going to just pull up the software and show people how this is done and how connectivity can be utilized practically. Now, this is our software. It is 100% cloud-based. It runs in Chrome. It does all of the processing steps. And right there. And I want to show you what this is capable of. This is a patient we treated in our clinic a few weeks ago. It's an 18-year-old who at 17 years old had a very large MCA stroke on the left side. To give it a second while it's pulling the files. The processing time is about an hour. We're going to have it down to 23 minutes relatively soon. And to kind of take you through the extent of this injury, just to show you that this is a pretty impressive stroke. As you can see, now pretty sizable. So it's not a tiny infarct here. And what we're able to do with the machine learning is we can actually begin to see the parcellations around this infarct. Now note that it didn't map any parcellations to the infarct because it shouldn't, right? It knows that there are no connections on the white matter that go there because they're gone. And so as a result, it determines that those parcellations shouldn't be mapped. And as you can see, it has a list of parcellations that are not there. So for example, the left frontal eye field, as expected, is not there. She's also missing a lot of area 4, but there are a few voxels of it. We're working on making tools that will tell you that area 4, for example, is decreased in size. also 55B is missing. So she came for language therapy. What's amazing is that she's able to talk at all, but she has some significant language problems. So as you can see over here, this in the DTI platform, we have different tools for subsetting the data. These are all based on the years of work that I've done mapping these to the same scheme. That S-shaped network that I showed earlier, this is all here, for those of you who want to get into that level of complexity. In addition, we have things like reading, math, neglect, apraxia, even Gerson syndrome mapped to this scheme. We have the ability to map white matter bundles, including corticospinal tract optic radiations. And we have all sorts of tools to work with this. But for simplicity's sake, let's start with network. And what I want to know is language. So if I click language, what that does is it calls the network for language. So you can see that this is her language network, her parcellations and tracks. And when we go through here, look through the data, you can see that while there's connections between the temporal areas and the parietal lobe, she's missing her arcuate fasciculus, which shouldn't be surprising given that she has a big infarct. She has a little bit of Broca's area, a little bit of area 45. So the first question we had was, how is she even talking at all? Well, we looked at her accessory language pathway. And as you can see, what's interesting is she sprouted new connections. So this is her collateral pathway. So now we have an idea of what we could potentially treat in her. Now, the other interesting thing is, how does her SMA even work? Well, we can look at that. So, for example, in sensory motor, we can pick the right side. Now, the left side SMA is already on here because it's part of the language system. But if we click right SMA, it adds that to this montage. And as you can see, there's a very thin fiber coming across there. So by some miracle, that's probably contributing. Now, so now we have a hypothesis on how she's even communicating. The question is, do we have connectivity problems there? So everything I clicked here, this is the resting state fMRI module. And as you can see, here's the matrix. Now, again, this is the anomaly detector. We default to this because it's actually the most useful. But to show everyone what the raw data look like, that's what they look like. So as you can see, there's the language system, the accessory language system, and then the right SMA. Notice that 55B is blacked out because it doesn't exist in her. Normally this would be like this. But of course, most of us don't know what this is supposed to look like. So we put on the anomaly detector. And as you can see, she has anomalies. For example, on the left side, TE1P, which is in the temporal lobe, and left TE1A are over communicating. That's probably part of her compensation. So do we want to turn that down? Well, that's an interesting question. We could also look at other potential things. So for example, looking at something like, okay, well, let's look at the rest of the default mode network, DMN. Now you see there's even more anomalies. And so again, if you look at this, that's potentially a target. You might want to turn that up or turn that down, but that's not normal. And as you can see here, TE1A. Now, whatever you decide to do, and again, we're still learning the technique. In a case this complex, you know, again, there's not a whole lot of what is the correct answer because we haven't had this technology long enough to see patients like this. But this is what we chose. And what that click that I did created was an object. That's that. So this is that parcellation. And so when I did that, it has now made that into a medical grade DICOM file, and I can export it and put it on image guidance and treat it with TMS. That's how simple it is to go from resting state connectivity that can be done on scanners in any hospital to having a target that's based on connectivity. Now the real question is, how do we figure out what the best targets are? Now, we're also working on a simplifying approach for surgery. So there's a product that we're coming out with hopefully this fall called QuickTome. And what it does is basically the disconnections that I described in my book are different collections of what do you want to see in a particular area. So if this was a glioma, this is a lateral frontal lobe, you would be wanting to do a lateral frontal disconnection. And so basically you'd want to see the language system in a normal person. Well, of course, to simplify it so that everyone doesn't have to do this series of clicks that I did every single time, we're actually have just simplified it to clicking lateral frontal lobe, and it will make those objects for you and automatically export them to image guidance. So there's a lot of ways we're working to make this simpler, but that's currently what we have available. And does anyone have questions? Because I've spent 2 hours talking now.
Did you want to see if people have questions, Mike?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, does anybody have questions in the panel? I'll just step right up. I noticed someone asked about a reference book to buy. Okay, you mentioned that already.
Yeah, let me,
Yeah,
I
if you
will
could put
actually
that in the
post some.
chat. If you
Yeah, I
could
will.
Put that in the chat. Dr. Khalil, I believe, had a question about a reference. He said it's complex. He wanted to read about it.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that you know, because this is a new field, I don't know why it won't let me type into the normal chat.
Okay.
Um,
The chat of the Zoom.
yeah, for some reason it won't let me.
It won't let you do that? Okay.
Dr. Bennett,
Let's go ahead.
I am Dr. Sahli from Algeria. It was amazing. Thank you, Dr. Sigru. And
Yes.
For those neurosurgeons who are not so specialized, what's your advice to start the comprehension of such techniques and such difficult anatomy? Thank you.
The answer to this is that there's not a lot of neurosurgically accessible reading on this. So if you don't want to get into the science like I did and have to learn it from scratch, to be honest, I'm one of the few people who's actually tried to translate the Connectome project into actual usable anatomy. I spent I'll just say that the book that I wrote has several entire chapters on brain networks and their anatomy. And they're fairly simple.
By the way, your book is exceptional. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now, thank you. The other place you can look if you want to go to the next level is chapter 1 of the. I wrote a supplement that was 18 papers. It was in operative neurosurgery last year, or 2018 now. And chapter 1 covers basics. It's just like, it's all about concept and what is connectomics and how do we make this atlas and everything like this. Now, the atlas is huge, and I've only met a few people who've actually gone through and read all of it because it is designed to be an atlas. It's very detailed. I think that we have to but again, skimming the atlas, looking through it, familiarizing yourself, particularly of the white matter tracks and what they're really doing, but most importantly, getting your mind around the concept. Because if you look at the 7 network approach to understanding it, it's a good way to put your feet into it. It's a massive, massive area, but at least it gives you a concept of, okay, how does cognition work in the human brain? And if you leave one thing, and I'll tell you that how I learned this and what got me interested in this. In 2012, I went about trying to operate on butterfly gliomas of the anterior corpus callosum because I thought that they had to be operable. And it ultimately was very frustrating because some patients did great and other patients did terrible. And so one day I kept the patients awake and I just saw what happened when I got near the corpus callosum. And I knew that there was something, I immediately found out there was something in the anterior cingulate that when you touched it, they stopped moving or doing whatever they're doing. And so there's a paper in JNS that I wrote in 2016 that we summarized this, and we figured out that what was in that area is the default mode network and the Salins network. I will say that if you leave with one thing, don't destroy the DMN. It's a really important part of the brain. The cingulate gyrus is not a very forgiving part of the brain, and while you might be able to remove it on one side, I would recommend not trying it unless it's already been destroyed by a tumor. So, as far as that it's interesting. Someone actually asked the question: in cases of cingulate gyrus tumors, how much can be done without harming the pathways? And the answer to this is, in general, if there's tumor in there, it might be operable. Okay, I have been able to remove some of it if it is clearly tumor and get away with it. But I'll tell you that I'm more nervous removing stuff out of the cingulate gyrus now that I know what's there, and doing an awake surgery than operating in the motor cortex, because in the worst case scenario, if somebody has a weak hand, they probably aren't going to lay there until they get a DVT. Whereas if you ruin the DMN, you made someone almost not, their life is meaningless at that point. And so it really is stressful. Now that I know what the anatomy is, it's very, very stressful. So what I would say is that you can do it. I have removed parts of the cingulate gyrus and had people be okay, but be very, very cautious and really look and think very carefully about what you're doing. Because again, I've had some bad experiences. And if you read the paper we wrote in JNS, it is a very, very honest paper that I spent many, many years learning the hard way of how to do those cases. So it absolutely is the 100% truth, and it's brutally honest about what happens if you don't achieve the goal of that operation. But my view on this is that those patients without surgery do so badly that we should really do whatever we can to help them. But it's very scary once you understand what's there. And I never thought twice about the cingulate gyrus when I was a resident.
Okay, Michael, we have a very prominent Indian neurosurgeon here. Atul Goel, do you want to ask Michael a question? Atul, are you there? Well, perhaps he stepped away. I'm sorry to interrupt, Michael.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Oh, there he is. Okay, he's here, Michael.
Michael,
Hi, Atul.
how are you? Michael, unfortunately, I couldn't hear your lecture. I wanted to hear badly, but somehow I mistook the time. But I'm sure many people would have loved your presentation and learned from so many nice things that you must have taught. I will take from John Bennett your this YouTube link, and I will see it properly. I just want to send you my best wishes and greetings, and I hope you will continue to teach the world this beautiful thing that you have learned and acquired. It is the in thing, it is the modern thing, it is the futuristic thing, and I'm sure this will come into vogue, this kind of fiber learning and various kinds of brain learning, and how to do glioma surgery and what is the strategy. My best wishes to you, Michael, and keep it up.
Yeah, thanks, Atul. Yeah, and like I said, if you have any questions after watching it, feel free to shoot it my way. I'm willing to talk about this all the time, as you know.
Thank you, thank you. I will certainly keep it up, Michael.
right, does anyone have any other questions?
Okay, any other questions in the panel or comments? Okay, carry on, Michael.
All right, well, thanks everyone. And of course, if anyone has questions, please contact us. If anyone's interested in the software, also please contact us. We can work on getting a demo and letting you see what the software can do. Like I said, I'm always open-minded to getting this idea out there. That's why I'm here at 11 o'clock at night, my time, to try to explain this. So thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, Michael, this video will be posted on the internet. It will be accessible, as well as Michael's contact info. So thank you, Michael. We'll end this now.
Yeah, and as far as Kaiser Haroon asked how to get the software, if you post your email, we can get someone to get in touch with you.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.